and welcome to Dip In and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm very fortunate on this Monday afternoon to be sitting down with Sam Billingham and Jared Whitaker. Now, both Jared and Sam have both appeared individually on the podcast to some amazing conversations that we've had around domestic abuse, around all the challenges and issues that many people face. But the beauty of what they both do is they're both passionate advocates who will obviously, tell you a bit about their own stories and why they're doing what they're doing. But it's important that this episode is around breaking down that stigma around what a victim looks like. Many people in society have this preconceived idea of what domestic abuse is, of what a victim looks like, sounds like, what they do for a living, all those different things that go on within abusive relationships. And so, I'll pass over to you both. Whoever wants to go first and introduce themselves again.
Sam, after you.
Thank you very much. So I'm Sam Billingham, better known as Soda Sam. So I started off almost 20 years ago with setting up an online support group called SODA, which stands for Survivors of Domestic Abuse. And it's an online support group for men and women to come together without judgment to share their lived experiences. Over the last 12 months or so, my journey has taken a different route. I'm still really passionate about raising awareness for both men and women, but I do a lot more around coercive control and what that looks like, what that feels like, and the impact of coercive control. So I'm more of an advocate stroke spokesperson. So I try and get a platform for other survivors to share their lived experience as well.
That's amazing. It is. And it's so important because, not even 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, coercive control was a term that was being thrown around, but nobody really understood what it meant because, we have the terms like gaslighting, we have everything else that goes with those kind of terminologies. And I suppose if somebody hasn't been in that situation, it can be really difficult to understand, well, what does that actually mean? They just seem like words that are out there that people are using and we don't really actually fully understand what it means. So thank you, Sam. Over to you, Jared.
Brilliant. So I'm Jared Whitaker. I am an author and I write books I don't write books for men. I write books about the issues men face with domestic abuse, false allegations, mental health issues, things like that. And I say they are about men's issues and they obviously are for men, but they are definitely for everyone because they obviously can help women as well. But, while a man gets abused, it can affect his mother, his daughter, his sister. So it affects families. It doesn't just affect the victim itself. So my books are for everyone, but it's trying to raise awareness again of it's not just women, it's not just small people. It's a victim knows no race, gender, size, nothing. So that's me.
Thank you. I love that. Exactly. And this is what's so fantastic is you're both doing the work in obviously slightly different ways, but that's the whole point is having those options, isn't it, for people? And I think when you've been in an abusive relationship, finding a way for you that's right for you is so important, but also breaking down those stigmas around, I actually mentioned Jared and I mentioned Sam, I mentioned you both in different things that I'm doing, if I'm doing talks or if I'm running any of my sessions. And, I will talk about the fact that Jared's a big guy. You won't mind me saying that. He's a big guy. You'd look at him and go, okay, I wouldn't mess with him in a dark alley. But actually, you get to know him and he's the loveliest, kindest man you could ever meet. And that's where we have to stop that judgment around that perception of what somebody looks like. And I think probably, in my view, it's more difficult for men than it is for women in that sense. And it's a question you get asked a lot, isn't it, around, I think, why is it so difficult for male victims to speak out? And again, it's that stigma around, well, how could you not look after yourself? How could you not, protect yourself? And that's what we need to step away from, because that blame and shame then falls on the male victim. And that's why there's so much underreporting. That's why people don't speak out.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back almost 20 years when I very, very, very first started sharing my lived experience, I did some volunteering at my local Sure Start Centre. And we were at this event and there was this guy, and again, he was about 6.5. I'm tiny, I'm 4'9". He's about 6.5 foot, ex-rugby player. And we'd been working alongside each other for quite a while. And we were actually at an event where I'd got an award for the work that I was doing at the time around domestic abuse. And all these years later, I can still see his face and the way he was talking and everything. And he said to me, I can tell you now. And I didn't, at that time, I didn't know what he was going to say to me because I was very new to this. I'd only just come out sharing my own lived experience. So there was this big tall guy and I was like, okay. And he said, I was a victim of domestic abuse. And to look at him, I was just like, oh my God, what do I say? First of all, I thought, oh my God, I'm a woman. So my first reaction was, oh my God, this is massive for this man to open up. And he's just told me this is the first time and I'm a woman. I was like, wow. To have that courage to do that was just overwhelming for me. And he said, I can tell you now because I'm out of that situation. I'm happily married to a lovely woman who's never abused him at all. But the person he was with before, she'd been brought up where, he'd been brought up where men don't hit women. But this perpetrator, she knew that and she used that to her advantage. So she was physically violent towards him because she knew there was no way he was going to do anything back. And then he told me about his experience when he went to the police. He actually found the strength and courage to report it. And his words were, they literally laughed me out of the police station. And I'm there and I was like, wow, this is massive for him to open up to me. I just listened. I just didn't know what to say at the time. And he said, I now understand because of your lived experience. So that was enough for him at the time. And my personal experience, even right up until right now, I have male survivors contact me constantly. There's one male survivor who he's had a terrible time with the police. He's got all the evidence you can think of. He's got all the evidence you can name. Still not enough. I find that there's this constant battle between men and women in this situation, whereas I try and raise awareness of the issue and the issues, not necessarily the gender. And I do that for that person who opened up to me almost 20 years ago. You know, I wouldn't be doing him any justice. You know, I know it took a lot of courage for him and the men who open up and the work that Jared's doing as well. And it's the stigma of like what you said, but why would you let your missus do that? What? And that is police officers. I know police officers who have this attitude and professionals who should be supporting these survivors, whether it's male or not, but more so male, because that's why they're not reporting, that's why they're not speaking out, because of this culture that, you know, why would you let your missus do that? Or, but you're a bloke, you can look after yourself. And it's the work that Jared's doing is trying to change that bit by bit. And it's frustrating because we seem to be going 2 steps forward and then 20 steps back.
Yeah.
I think something that's really important, Sam, and I'm going to sing our praises for a bit, which is who it is you are a female advocate that advocates for everyone. I'm a male advocate that advocates for everyone, and unfortunately, you get a lot that aren't like that. You get a lot of guys who are bitter and hate women, and you get a lot of women who are bitter and hate guys. And it's so ridiculous because anyone getting abused is wrong, and anyone who abuses anyone is wrong. So we shouldn't be, again, like you say, raise the issue. And the issue is it can happen to anyone, and people need to understand that. But, it's interesting you say about that guy. He only came forward and spoke to you because you came forward first. And that's generally how most guys are.
That really broke my heart. I just didn't know what to say. I didn't know what I should say, what I shouldn't say. And he could obviously see that when we were talking, and he just said, I know you understand. And I get a lot of, especially men. So when I've done my TV work and things like that, I'll get male survivors reach out via email and things. And it is purely because I understand. They don't, and that took me a long time to understand that, because like you've just said, Jared, I've been asked, oh, you hate men. No, trust me, I do not hate men. I do not hate men, but I hate abusers, I hate perpetrators, I hate rapists, I hate all those people, but I don't hate men. So I'm really privileged when a male survivor reaches out to me. I'm really honoured in my own mind. That is, a massive, massive step. But it is purely because I understand. And it's this, the cycle is virtually the same. So you and I could speak about our lived experience, and you could say, oh yeah, that happened to me, and I could say exactly the same. But for some bizarre reason, society sometimes thinks that it's different. The situation itself isn't different, but unfortunately the reaction that male survivors get when they open up, that's different.
Yeah.
I've done some work, well, not done some work, but I've been doing some work with the Paul Lavelle Foundation, and they actually invited me to one of their online drop-in sessions. There was about 12 guys and me, and again, it's like, oh God, I'm a woman, and most of these have been, you know, abused by a female. But once we got the conversation going, there were so many similarities that we kind of blinded to think about because of the stereotypical attitude of male survivors speaking out, and we need to kind of shift that somehow. And obviously through the work Jared and I are doing, hopefully we can do that.
Every talk I do for men's groups or talking to women, it doesn't matter if it's men or women, always the same comment. Oh, I think we dated the same person. I think we, you know, we're married to the same person.
I was going to say that.
Doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman.
Yeah.
Again, the only difference changes is when you get to the tail end of it and you're trying to get like with the police, or I mean, I was also literally laughed in my face by the police, screamed at by judges, you know, just because of how I look.
And like, you know what, that's the thing though, is there is that, you know, people often say is that blueprint, isn't there, around abuse. And Sam, when she was just saying before then about with this chap in particular, the woman knew that he wasn't somebody from his past. And Jared spoke about this in the episode we did. And it's that idea that actually what we're going to do as an abuser is we're going to take what you've told us as something so delicate, so private, so between a couple, an intimate couple, and I'm now going to turn that around and I'm going to use it against you. And that's where, you know, from that beginning of the love bombing and all of that, where you share everything, you know, you think you trust this person, so you tell them everything. What you don't know is what that person's actually doing. And again, I think it's the same in all relationships, all abusive relationships, is the abuser wants that power and control. So they will remember all these things, make a little mental note and go, right, now I know exactly how to hurt you. And when the time's right, I'm going to bring that up and I'm going to use it against you. And I think that is the same across the board. And that's why it's so terrifying that those kind of blueprints, you know, like you say, you both can have conversations with people. And so often people go, oh my God, that's exactly what happened to me. Or it's this happened to me slightly differently, but and all these things keep, you know, this cycle keeps coming around again and again. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I mean, into terms of breaking that cycle, but I tried to call my website You Don't Own Me because I didn't want it having a female feel to it. I didn't want to have it a male feel to it. I wanted it to have that you don't own me, i.e. you're a human being and nobody has any right to own anybody else. And I think you're right. Sometimes you do come up against walls because it's, well, you know, it's either one foot in one camp, one foot in the other, etc. And it can be really difficult. But if more people could do this and have this kind of conversation and have the respect for each other to have that kind of conversation, then I think we would be 20 steps forward.
Yeah.
I did a talk a couple of weeks ago at a college, a local college, and they didn't have to come, so I wasn't sure how many people would turn up, but there were 2 males and the rest were females. And the one thing that I really liked was, before I even did anything, the one young lad said to me, you do know it happens to men as well, don't you? And I love that because they're at that difficult age of growing up anyway. So he was about 16, 17, and he said that, and I went, you're absolutely right. And I always have a slide in my presentations with a male image, and I talk about Alex Skeel, mainly because his perpetrator was the first female who was in prison for coercive control. But I like that they're calling me out before they even know anything about me, before I've even said anything, and I love that. And I actually called out their tutor, because she sent me some information over before I actually did the talk, and she'd been talking to the pupils about a typical abuser. And that played on my mind because I was like, wow, where's this conversation going? Because there is no typical abuser. You know, Jared and I are very, very, you know, I'm 4'9", I'm very petite, and, you know, you're tall, and, you know, we're all different. So, but when I asked her and said, can you describe to me what you kind of said in that conversation, she couldn't give me an answer. She just got this really nervous laugh. So when I asked the students, in their mind, they've got someone who was unemployed, you know, somebody who's got a beard. Sorry, Jared, somebody who's got a beard, you know, the way they dressed. And I actually said, it could be any one of us in this room. It could even be me, for all you know, just because I'm standing up here and I seem really nice. I said, it could actually be your tutor. I said, it can be anyone. But I was just a bit disappointed and surprised that she couldn't give me some more information on what she'd actually said to the pupils before I got there about this typical type, because there is, as we know, there is no typical type.
Well, if you think about narcissists, right, and you're going to find probably a lot of teachers, a lot of healthcare workers, a lot of charity workers, and they're the nicest people you'll ever meet in your life, and they're so wonderful, and people sing their praises about how marvelous they are because all they know is this facade that they put on. And so you could think, oh, there's absolutely no way this marvelous, wonderful human being could do this, but that's the one you watch out for,
Yeah,
like the one that comes across as perfect.
Well, I think that's why sometimes as well, maybe it is harder when, you know, sometimes I think as those who work around domestic abuse, maybe we judge society, you know, in some ways thinking, well, why can't you see it? But I suppose if you step into their shoes and think somebody's a head teacher, somebody's a judge, somebody's a police officer, somebody's a nurse, a doctor, whoever, you know, these are all people who you would, you know, you put your life in their hands, you're trusting them. They have authority over your life, if you like. If you're in hospital, they're taking care of you. You're in a courtroom, they're deciding what happens. These are all people, but it doesn't mean that they can't be perpetrators. I did actually an episode of a podcast called The Blue Murder Club, and they wanted to talk about post-separation abuse. And they covered a case, and it was called the British Airways murder. And he was a captain of this aircraft, obviously. And him and his wife had split up. In this case, it was, but they were talking about lots of different cases. But the point of it was the position he was in was a captain. You know, nobody would have suspected for 1 second that that could be the case, but it could as easily have been a female captain. It could have easily, you know what I mean? The point is that it doesn't matter what position you're in, what role you're in. I actually think that protects them a lot more, because who's gonna push that button? Who's gonna, you know, make that call and say, actually, I think this person is. And the more power, I think sometimes the more authority they have, not only the more protected, but the more they realise they can get away with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what worries me.
But they seek out positions of power, authority, or recognition. So, like a lot of charity work and stuff like that. But it's interesting you made that point about how we judge society, you know, as people who are in this thing. And I liken it recently to the Matrix. You're kind of in this matrix and you live in this world that you don't know what it is, but then you get woken up because it happens to you and you get pulled into it. And I sit and I think, how many of us who do what we do would like to go back to the way it was when we didn't know all of this? Ignorance is bliss kind of thing. And I wouldn't want to, but sometimes it seems, you know, quite, because it's a lot. I mean, I'm sure, Sam, you find the same. It's a lot day in, day out to deal with this kind of stuff.
It is, yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting point. So I was invited to a male survivor support group a few years ago, and again, I was the only female, and I was really worried how they would feel about a female sharing her experience with them. And there was about 10 guys around this table, and I walked in and I was so nervous purely because I was female, and here I am, you know, in front of these males, and there was this one guy sort of directly in front of me, and I remember looking at him and I thought, oh God. He just sat there, you know, his arms folded and everything. I thought, oh no, he's going to be a tough nut to crack. So shared my story, and then at the end, his words were, oh my God, that's exactly what happened to me. And his perpetrator was female, and she was actually a nurse. So no one believed him at all because she was a nurse. And like you say, who's going to question that? You know, she's out there saving lives and doing whatever she's doing. But it was only, again, because of my experience. He was going on the fact that I was a woman and he was a man, and somehow it was going to be very different. But just what you've said as well, Jerry, domestic abuse has changed me completely as a person. I am so judgmental. I work everyone out, every meeting I go to, everywhere I go, I walk in the room and I look at everyone and I try and work everyone out, because my barriers are down all the time. And I made a promise to myself that no one would ever treat me the way that person did. So I think I'm a terrible, not terrible, but it has changed me a lot. Whereas before, you know, I'd kind of wouldn't think of anything like that at all. What's this person going to do? I listen to every single word a person says. I listen to everything. I read body language, everything, purely because the perpetrator I existed with was very, very controlling. So he didn't have to physically hurt me. I'd have to try and read his body language, which was really, really hard because he never gave off anything. So I didn't know when he was angry. He never shouted. He never raised his voice. I had to try and work all that out in the moment. And I am very, very much like that now. So if we were all at an event in person right now, I would be like working everyone out just purely to keep myself safe. But before domestic abuse, none of that would have even entered my head at all. So it does change you completely. And I think whether I feel it's a bad thing because I know not everyone is a perpetrator, but that is how I've been made to feel by one person. And I hate it. I hate it, but I can't stop because that's my safety mechanism now. Even though it's been a long time since I'm out of that situation, that is still very much my safety mechanism.
I think in that sort of instance, I mean, this is me now, always trying to put a silver lining on everything. My husband goes mad. He's like, I'm an eternal optimist. I don't know how. Not gonna lie, I'm not quite sure how. But what I love about that is, you know, yes, obviously, like you say, you're sort of weighing people up. But what I really, really want to see in the future when it comes to children in schools, in secondary schools, in primary schools, when they're leading up to going into secondary, that's something I'm really passionate about. And I think if we taught children more boundaries,
Oh yeah.
and you know, and what you're doing there is having boundaries. You're saying, I'm not going to let, you know, people say, oh, well, you give everybody a go, give everybody a try, first try. And if they let you down, actually, no, you're quite within your rights to go, I'm going to reserve judgment until I make up my mind. And that's my boundary. And I think if more children were given that as an option, having boundaries, then maybe situations like abusive relationships in the future wouldn't be something that they would be involved in. Because, and again, with schools, you know, you're talking about going to the college, if the teachers, you know, if they were more educated, if they understood more about it, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I think, having worked for the charity I worked for and I did an episode with one of the children, young persons managers at the time, and we were talking about how schools it's not a prerequisite for them to have somebody come in and do these talks. Now, I think that's terrible. I think they should. And what it makes you wonder then is, like we were just talking about before, about those in positions of power. Who's to say that the head teacher isn't a perpetrator? Or even is just as bad is to say that doesn't happen in our school. You know, again, that's the impression I sometimes get, is it's kind of, well, that wouldn't that wouldn't happen here. And again, it's, why are we not just saying this could happen to anybody? We want people coming in, talking to our children in an age appropriate way, but for them then to have those tools, because that cycle is never going to break if we don't educate the children of the future.
Every single guy I've ever spoken to about this kind of thing has said the same words, including me. That will never happen to me. Every single one. And we all start off thinking that. So yeah, I do this campaign called Read the Change, where I basically take my books and I send them places that I think they should be. So police stations, courthouses, and something I'm going to start doing in the new year when I get the funds for it is sending them to high schools and saying, here they are, put them in the library. I'll happily come in and give a talk about the stuff they mean. You know, kids are welcome to try and, you know, laugh at me and be like, ha ha, it happened to a guy or whatever. But you know, it's just so necessary, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really is. It really is. I'm doing some work with the Holly Gazzard Trust, and they do a lot of work with schools. And I shadowed the very first one, and it was, once you get the conversation started, they do understand and know a lot more than we think. And again, that's really scary because they're children. But once you start the conversations going, they have an inkling of what coercive control is and what domestic abuse is. And then it makes you think, is that what they're seeing at home, or is that their relationships that they're forming themselves? So I think the books and the work that you're doing, and I think even more so that it's from a male survivor, is more empowering. Because like I say, the ones that I do, they'll always, and it's always a young lad who'll always say, you do know it happens to men, don't you? And that's so sad, because they should know that I'm here to talk about domestic abuse, whether you're male, female, whatever you are. But for them to actually sit there and say that in front of everybody and their tutors as well, for them to actually say, you know, it happens to men as well. And I like it because they're calling me out. I like that, but they shouldn't have to. They
No.
should know in their mind from the work that people like Jared does and the books and everything that, you know, when someone's talking about coercive control and domestic abuse, they are including me, even though I'm male. So it's quite sad, really, and
Well,
at that age as well.
there's two important things I want to add there. Is one, it's not you, obviously, because you're a woman, they'll do it. But if a 5'6", very petite man went in and did it, they'd say, "You do know it can happen to bigger guys, don't you?" And it's
Yeah,
one of the reasons why I decided to do what I'm doing is because I'm 6'2", I weigh 120 something kilos, I'm built like an outhouse. You know, you don't get much bigger. So it kind of paints the picture that, look, if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone,
absolutely,
kind of thing.
absolutely.
And the second thing is, it's so important the stuff you're doing around coercive control, because so many of the men who reach out to me and I have like one-on-one phone calls or things with, men don't realize they're being abused until it becomes physical.
Yeah,
So they think like,
absolutely.
oh, well, I got punched, now I'm being abused. I had a guy send me a thing. He said, oh, sorry to bother you. This is how it always, my messages always start with, sorry to bother you, but could you help? And I always do. And he said, look, what I've been doing is over the past 2 years, I've put together an Excel spreadsheet of every incident I think's not right. And can I send it to you and you give me your opinion on whether you think I'm being abused or not? So he sent me this thing and it was like 600 lines in an Excel sheet. I think I read the first two and was like, yeah. And I looked at it and I calculated it from the sheet. He had spent about 400 and something days, I can't remember exactly, sleeping in his car when they shared a house together. And he was asking me, am I being abused? Because she wasn't hitting him.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
And that, yeah.
I do a lot of work around coercive control, as you know, and during lockdown, I set up something called MTAB, which means more than a bruise. And I had loads of men and women reach out to me, very much the same, because they're not physically hurt. They don't think they're abused. And I was exactly the same in that situation. So it was really, really controlling before it got physical. And the physical didn't happen all the time. And I wasn't mentally strong enough to put the two and two together at the time until I'd got out of that situation. And then I realised I'd just been completely controlled from day one. And that's why I do a lot of work around coercive control. But the scary thing is, the professionals, they don't even understand coercive control either. So what do we do? Where do we go? How can we keep people safe? We can raise the awareness, which is brilliant. But what happens after that?
Yeah.
What happens when people report it and they say, oh, you haven't got enough evidence, there's no evidence, but they've got evidence like that spreadsheet. So you and I, we'd know what the red flags were, we'd know, but
yeah.
does anybody else, would a professional know that? I think the majority would not. Therefore, it's not taken seriously, even though it's supposed to be under the Serious Crimes Act, which is nearly 10 years old, and we haven't moved any further forward at all with coercive control. I don't think we have.
I think, and also because with coercive control, it's not just society and professionals that don't understand it. Like say, victims don't understand it. So if the whole kind of, the whole entity of it, both victim and society and profession, if they don't understand that actually it doesn't have to be, is it abuse if my partner doesn't hit me? Yes, it is. And that's where, one thing that always gets me every year is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So if I ever do any talks or any courses, I will always say Domestic Abuse Awareness Month. And I've had a few people correct me and say, oh no, isn't it Domestic Violence Awareness Month? So it may very well be called that. But I march to beat my own drum, and as far as I'm concerned, abuse is much bigger than that. And now I'm going to go in and explain why it's so much bigger than that, because it isn't always about the physical aspect. And then you sort of see the light bulbs going on, like, oh God, yeah, okay. Oh, so verbal abuse, oh, emotional abuse, all right, financial abuse. And the penny starts to drop, but it takes time. And I think that those are the things that are problems to me is, we need to change things like that. We need to change from the outset that idea of what abuse looks like. So I will always use, for me, my specialism is post-separation abuse. I don't call it post-separation violence because that can happen as well. Just because somebody's no longer in a relationship doesn't mean they're not being stalked and harassed. But for me, it's abuse rather than, let's call it what it is, the whole umbrella of it all, rather than focusing on the physical. And
Yeah.
somebody said a while ago, in another episode, he's a police officer called, well, he was, sorry. And we were talking about, this stems from sort of like the 1950s, that idea, very much around what abuse looked like. And it was, obviously that idea that a man hits a woman and that's it. It's evolved so much more. And it's not to say that it wasn't going on then, it will have been, women will have been being abusive just as long as both sides would. But that's the thing that gets me, is we need to step away from that idea of saying domestic violence. I think we need to really embrace the idea of accepting it for what it is, which is domestic abuse.
Yeah, whenever I do podcasts or talks with Americans, because they call it domestic violence, and I always explain that to them as well, that I call it domestic abuse because domestic violence is merely a part of domestic abuse,
Yeah.
and try and explain that to them, and they generally can't get it, but you still try and explain
Yeah.
it to them. But yeah,
It's tough. It's tough. And I think that's the thing, is if we're not, I went back to something recently in a conversation around, somebody was talking about lockdown, and I said, if at the time we had a prime minister that was saying, you're not allowed to leave your home, but you're allowed to leave your home if you're being domestically abused. I mean, if that isn't the, oh, okay then. Well, if it was that easy, everybody would do that. That for me summed everything up. And we're talking only a few years ago there. And it wasn't even at the very beginning of all those speeches and all those, reports and everything else. This was quite far along, and it was, you're not allowed to, but you can if you're being abused. And that just summed it up for me. I thought that is how far behind the times we are in understanding abuse, to turn around and say something like that in such a flippant way. I was incensed, I'll say is the word.
oh, hence why I called my first book "Why Didn't You Just Leave Them?" Because the amount of people that say nonsense like that. And funnily enough, obviously, that documentary that was on Channel 5, that My Wife, My Abuser, is now on Netflix. So
Yeah.
obviously, a lot more people are watching it now that it's on Netflix. And the first person who I'm connected to on TikTok to post something about it, some woman commented, "Why didn't he just leave her? He's just as guilty as she is." And I
Mm.
thought, oh, like,
Do you know, it's funny, I did a post on LinkedIn the other week, and I'm always trying to come up with an answer. When people say that to you, and it's, and you go into all the explanations. And then I came up with something today and I thought, actually, that for now, it'll do. And it was when people ask that question, why didn't they just leave? The response, the person who's being abused should feel comfortable enough and safe enough to say, why would you assume I could?
yeah.
This is where we need to get to the point, is what makes you think, what gives you the authority to think that you know enough about my life, enough about what I've experienced to say, just leave. Well, how do you know I could?
But
And that for
something
me kind of sums it up.
something I've realized with the books I've written so far is that I've given information, like what are the types of abuse, what are tools and techniques a narcissist use. I've given, some how it affects you mentally and that, but it's very hard to understand it when you haven't lived it, obviously. But it's very hard to understand how information about something translates into how it actually affects you. And that's why my latest one that just came out, I wrote it as a fiction first person view from a male being abused, because obviously then you can see his state of mind, his emotional state, how he thinks, is it me, not her, things like that, how it actually breaks you down and controls you and keeps you there.
Yeah,
Because people who say stuff like that, like, honestly, it boils my blood. Because I
yeah.
mean, obviously we know because we part of this world and they don't, but it's so offensive when people say
Yes,
that.
absolutely. I remember the first time somebody asked me that, and I just stood there looking at them as if to say, if it was that easy, I really would have done, but it's not. And it's that impact of the coercive control. He knew everything about me. He knew where I lived, my family lived, my friends lived. They know everything about you before you get to that point. That's where the coercive control comes into play, because that's what domestic abuse is about. I think we often focus on the physical violence, which we all know that is part of domestic abuse, but it's power and control at the end of the day. It's that person having that much power over you that you're absolutely frightened to do anything. I couldn't even go to the toilet without being timed. I couldn't do anything. So if it was that easy to leave, we would do that.
Yeah.
And I think the impact of what we've survived as well, I think that's really something we don't talk a lot about either. It's sort of, you got the awareness, and then You talk about a little bit of life after domestic abuse, but it's the actual impact, you know, the highs and lows. I've had depression, anxiety, all these things, and it's all because of my lived experience of coercive control and domestic abuse.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've said before, it's almost like for the person, it's like coming out of a fog, because again, you know, a lot of these things become normalized to that person. And Tony Blockley's head of criminology at Leeds Trinity Uni, and he came on last year and we did an episode around domestic homicide, and he was saying when he was a police officer, you go to a particular incident and it would be a high risk situation, high risk case. You're trying to explain to a victim that they are high risk, and they're looking at you as if to say, but this is how my life is, this is normal. And so again, you know, if we're finding it hard to talk to victims and survivors who, like you say, the impact, I'd done a blog the other day around you know, when something as simple as choosing the type of tea you drink, how you have your hair, how you dress, whether you have a beard or not, whatever it is, it's so insidious and it's so deeply rooted that for somebody to try and understand and say, what do you mean you couldn't drink the tea you liked? No, because that was something that was very, very slowly introduced. Oh, we don't need to drink that kind of tea anymore. We'll drink this because I like it. And because many, many times a victim just doesn't want to rock the boat, doesn't want to end up rowing or falling out and all those kind of things, whereas actually it's just them being abusive. It can be something as simple as a tea bag, you know, and that for me is where it's so difficult for people to understand, and so difficult for victims and survivors to get their heads around that, because you know this was your norm. And now if you are fortunate enough to be in a situation where you are no longer in that relationship, you still then potentially have post-separation abuse to deal with for I always say this, it's a marathon, not a sprint. It will go on for a very long time. I never kind of go under the illusion to anybody that it's going to be straightforward, because it's not. But actually, you know, these are things that we need to try and explain to people. And like, it's so hard because it's normalized.
Yeah. It's funny you say teabag as your example, because one of the things that was my experience was I wasn't allowed to use my own teabag. I had to use a teabag that she had used, because
Wow.
it was a waste using a teabag for myself, basically. Well, that's what I was told, you
That
know.
you weren't worth, and that's down to, and that then affects, talking about the impact, that affects your self-worth, that affects your self-esteem, because therefore you're psychologically being told you're not worthy of having your own tea.
Yeah.
And you know, from funnily enough, from that blog and that post I did, I've had a few people message me on LinkedIn who have been male and said, I don't want to, for various reasons, I don't want to, you know, kind of speak out, and I can't, and it maybe sometimes it's legal, it depends on what the situation is. But they will say, I'm just so glad I feel seen. You know, thank you for making me feel seen. And at the end of the day, I literally can put my head on the pillow at night and go, I've done something good today. If that one person, that one male has felt that they are not going insane, you know, they're not losing. And in this situation, he said, his wasn't tea bags, it was jam, you know, type of jam. And this just shows just how intrinsic it is in your life, and how much they can control you.
Yeah.
And, you know, when they talk about it being linked to the ideas around Stockholm syndrome, you know, being in love with your captor, because you're dead, you know, it's like fight, flight, freeze, flop, however many more there are now. They seem to have added 20 more onto that. I've given up. Seems to be, my friend's a psychotherapist. I'm like, oh, stop, there's too many now. I can't cope. But it's that idea that you can't, you know, you are in that situation and you will do anything to survive it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's where we need to kind of change the idea that it's so simple, it's so straightforward. You just walk out the door. That's not the case.
But you know, when people think that abuse is violence, like imagine you meet someone new, right? Now you meet the biggest abuser on the planet, and you don't know they're an abuser, obviously, because they're fake and they're charming and whatever. And you go on a first date with them. Do you sit down for your meal and they reach over and punch you in the face? No,
Exactly.
because you're going to get up and you're going to walk off and you're never going to come back, because there's no trauma bond there. There's nothing. You don't owe them anything. So it takes time for them to gain the control to manipulate you. So it's way more than just physical.
Yeah. And Sam mentioned this, funnily enough, in the episode. Tell you what, I'm surprised with perimenopause, how much I'm remembering from both your episodes. I'm quite impressed with myself. But I remember we talked about this, and it was, if you walked in, you're going on a first date or something, and you walked into the pub, you're not going to go, oh, I'm looking for a really abusive relationship here. I'm looking for somebody that's going to treat me like absolute dirt. Yeah, that's not how it happens. And like you say, they don't reach across the table and punch you on the first date. That's where I think films have a lot to blame for a lot of this as well, in terms of how we perceive things. And I'll always say, you watch a lot of these films that bring in domestic abuse as part of the storyline, but after 2 hours, it's all sorted. They've either killed them, they've either killed themselves, whatever's happened, and everyone rides off into the sunset and everything's fine. It's just, I'd rather they did something where it left it realistically like, and now you're going to go through post-separation abuse. None of this trying to sew it all up, because it's giving young people that false idea that it's some kind of action, to me, it's like, oh, look at this, it's not exciting, it's terrifying.
And it's just a blip in your life, and it'll all be fine after that little blip. No, it won't.
No,
but
let's be real about it. And I think that's where, what you two are doing is incredible, because you're doing it in a realistic way, and that's how it has to be done. Because unfortunately, with this subject, you can't kind of skirt around the edges. You've got to, and like you say, you both get questions from people that might, well, at the end of the day, make you feel quite hurt that they would think that about you, but you actually keep doing it, and you're doing it because you want that change. And it is probably a long way off the way we're going.
I mean, I get those, and I also get various forms of threats, insults, whatever else going from people like trying to stop me doing what I'm doing. But it's amazing.
Yeah, I've had that as well. I think that's common. I've had that as well. But what I've started doing, just talking about questions and things, is I actually leave lots of time so people can actually ask a specific question around coercive control and domestic abuse. And some of them are so interesting that I haven't even thought of myself. So that really gets the conversation going as well. But also, just something Lucy said, I mean, the person I existed with was an alcoholic. So sometimes I would have to fuel his habit just so I could stay safe. So I would have to go to the shop to buy his alcohol to give to him, because if he didn't have it, I don't know what would happen to me. So I think those kind of things are really difficult to explain to people who've never been in that situation, because why would you do that? Because if he didn't have it, it could also happen as well, but it's highly likely that it wouldn't happen if he's got the alcohol.
Yeah.
And you learn those things as you go along. You're sort of safeguarding yourself all the time, and you have to do whatever it is you have to do to stay alive, really.
Yeah.
Well, one of the women that I interviewed for one of my books, and it ties down, it's a really interesting point that I think people need to understand, is her family couldn't get the fact that why didn't she just leave him and say, she could leave and go and stay with them or whatever. And she was saying to them, and then she said to me in the interview that better the devil you know. I was there with him, and I knew where he was. I knew that I knew it would get taken out on me, but I knew he wouldn't hurt my kids. I knew he wouldn't go after them if I tried to leave him. I knew he wouldn't go after my family. So I did what I had to do, and I stayed with him to keep him in sight, basically.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. The same with mine. He got mannerisms where I knew something was going to happen and things like that. So it is easier sometimes to stay. I totally understand that. Really, I do. It's as we say it out, I don't know if it's the same for you, but as we talk about it now, it just seems like I'm talking about a whole different world, because it just doesn't sound as though it should be real, as though this thing should be happening, somebody timing you when you go to the toilet, someone telling you can only use one tea bag, someone telling it doesn't sound as though it should be happening. But I never reported it or anything because it was my normal. I just thought this is what happens, this is love. But as we talk about it now,
you believe you deserve it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think as well, you both just give me an idea for a blog, by the way. Thank you very much. What was it? I'm just listening. It's just brilliant. And what I was just thinking is, if you were in, I've done an episode recently on the Smart Divorce podcast. We're talking about post-separation abuse, talking about how difficult divorce is, no matter what. Very, very rarely is a divorce going to end amicably. It's more often than not going to be quite difficult. But add into that then domestic abuse, historical abuse that's gone on, add in then post-separation abuse, and you're talking a whole other ball game and horrific. And what it's just made me think about then is, we all fear, like you say, better the devil you know, is we all fear change, whether it's changing careers, changing schools when you're a kid, all those kind of things. How much more is there to fear when you have been so controlled by somebody that the thought of leaving and actually being able to do something for yourself, that's mine, because for a lot of people, I can't actually do that for myself because I don't know how to. I've never done any of these things. They controlled all the finances. They controlled who I saw in terms of friends and family. So I have nobody to turn to anymore. Those are all the things that we all fear change, but how much more fearful is it for somebody that's, oh, I'm going to remember that.
Well,
So true.
I used to be terrified of everything, and this was actually before my abuse. Growing up as a kid, I was very scared of everything. I was very badly bullied at school, and I was always scared. Walking down the street, coming home late at night. I was always like terrified something was going to happen. Now, afterwards, I'm completely the opposite. I'm afraid of nothing.
Yeah.
Like, I pretty much lived in hell. So what the hell do I have to be afraid of now?
What have you got to lose?
It's basically the conversation I had with my dad earlier today. Into people, because I'm small and I'm female, a lot of men do think they can intimidate me, but nothing works because I've been, like you just said, I've been through hell. What else can hurt me now? It's all been said to me by someone, who's supposed to love me. And so whatever anyone says or does to me doesn't have the impact that they think it's going to have, because of my lived experience. So I can definitely relate to what you've just said.
I think for both of you as well, it's that kind of, when we all think, well, there's always somebody worse off. There's always some, we're all brought up with those ideas, weren't we, from our parents? Well, you think you're in a bad situation, imagine such and such thing. But I think for both of you as well, it's that, you've both got a great perspective because you have been to hell and are coming out of that. And no one's saying that it's easy. And no one's saying, the impact is there and will last as long as it lasts. But both of you have that perspective of, well, actually, I've been there and I don't think there's much worse that can happen than that, apart from dying, probably. Therefore, I've got nothing to lose. And that's why you both fight as hard as you do for change, because your perspective is that brilliant, which I'm not saying you want everyone to have that perspective, because we don't want everyone going through abuse. That's the whole point of this episode. But the idea around that you both have that perspective of, well, I've got nothing to lose. I've been through so much that this is so important that change needs to happen.
I think two really important points I'd like to make about what you just said. One, to me, dying is better than going through that again.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but two, it comes into this understanding what is hell. I think particularly for guys is, so like let's take that thing that's on Netflix now, that My Wife, My Abuser. It's really good that it's out there because people can see that it happens to guys. But one negative thing, and I'd like for every guy, particularly who's going to listen to this, to understand is, don't watch it and think, oh, well, he's got it much worse. Because I mean, that's a very worst case scenario kind of show. So don't watch it and think, oh, well, he's got it much worse. I'm just going to shut up and not complain, because as guys we're told, you don't complain, you don't moan or whatever. When I sat and watched it, I thought, oh, well, he got much worse than me. Like, and funnily enough, when I sit down and analyze it now, he had it worse than me physically, nowhere near as bad emotionally and mentally from what they showed. So then I'm kind of like, then I even felt like that, someone who knows all about it. So a lot of guys who don't are going to watch it and think like, oh, okay, mine's not that bad, never mind. But don't think that.
No, never think that. Never. No, I see that a lot on social media where, oh, but mine didn't happen like that. Abuse is abuse in whatever context it's happened. It's wrong. It shouldn't happen. But there is a lot of that. Oh, well, theirs was worse than mine, so I won't say anything. I'd urge anyone, same as Jared, to speak out to someone, especially males, get in touch with Jared, because the stigma that's attached to male survivors is horrific, really. So yeah.
I love that. I was going to say, if either of you want to sum up, because I think Sam's just summed up for itself quite perfectly. But if either of you want to add anything else, I think, yeah.
I think selfishly, from my point of view, is buy my new book because it's The Words We Never Heard. It's the first person view from a guy in an abusive relationship. It's his journal during the relationship, and I think it really gives you an insight into what it's actually like to be in an abusive relationship. I will say up front, because I've been blasted on a few reviews for not putting a trigger warning in,
Yeah,
it's a hard read. It's not a pleasant book,
yeah,
but it's a necessary book, unfortunately.
yeah, quite right. I can't thank you both enough. I think we could. I often say this. We could go on for hours. We've just touched the surface of this conversation. But you know what I hope from all this is that it shows people that we can have a conversation, and we can have a conversation that actually brings up a lot of really valid points from both sides, and especially around the idea that male victims do exist. It's not an enigma. They exist. They're there. And that we all should be, maybe next time we look at somebody, we maybe should think twice before we judge. Definitely. Thank you both so much for joining me this
Thank you so
afternoon.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Where